The shadow behind the smile. Ethan Brooks adjusted the side mirror of his postal van, sighing as he leaned back in the driver's seat. It was another sunny morning in Brookwood Estates, a neighborhood that epitomized suburban perfection. The lawns were manicured, the hedges trimmed into neat symmetry, and every mailbox sparkled with fresh paint. On the surface, it seemed like nothing could go wrong in such a picturesque place. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 9:52 a.m. He was already behind schedule. A minor delay caused by a detour earlier that morning had thrown him off track, but Ethan prided himself on maintaining order in his work. Late deliveries gnawed at him, even if no one else noticed. As he turned into Magnolia Lane, a familiar route he'd driven for years, he spotted a little girl sitting on the curb in front of the Harris residence. Her name was Lily, bright, energetic, and always eager to meet him. But today, she wasn't bouncing on her toes or waving enthusiastically. She sat slumped, her knees drawn to her chest, and her long blonde hair hung limply over her face. Ethan parked the van, grabbed the small stack of mail addressed to the Harris family, and stepped out into the warm morning air. "Hey, Lily," he called, trying to infuse his voice with the usual cheer. "How's my favorite reader doing today?" Lily looked up slowly, her big green eyes dull and rimmed with redness. Ethan's heart sank as he noticed the faint bruise peeking out from under the short sleeve of her pink shirt. The mark was faint but unmistakable, a deep purple stain against her pale skin. "Hi, Mr. Ethan," she said softly, her voice devoid of its usual spark. "Is everything okay, kiddo?" Ethan asked, crouching down to meet her gaze. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "Yeah, everything's fine," she mumbled, avoiding his eyes. Ethan frowned, his instincts telling him otherwise. He knew kids fell and got bruises, but there was something about the way Lily fidgeted and refused to look at him that set off alarm bells in his head. He glanced toward the house. The curtains were drawn, and the front door was shut tight. He'd delivered mail here dozens of times, usually greeted by Lily's mother, Clara, who would chat briefly before thanking him. But today the house seemed eerily silent. "Your mom around?" Ethan asked casually, handing her the stack of letters. Lily shook her head quickly. "She's busy," she said, clutching the mail tightly. Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to pry, but the gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't let him walk away. "Well, if you ever need to talk, or need anything at all, you let me know, okay?" he said gently. Lily nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Without another word, she stood up and hurried back to the house, disappearing inside before Ethan could say anything more. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Ethan standing there with a growing unease. He returned to his van and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. He'd been delivering mail in Brookwood Estates long enough to notice when the subtle rhythms of a household shifted. But what could he do? He was just a mailman, not a social worker or a cop. Shaking his head, Ethan started the engine and pulled away, telling himself he was overthinking it. Still, the image of Lily's bruised arm and haunted expression lingered in his mind as he continued his route. By the time Ethan returned to Magnolia Lane later that afternoon to finish his deliveries, the unease had settled into a persistent knot in his chest. As he approached the Harris residence, he saw Lily again. This time, she wasn't sitting on the curb but running, sprinting toward his van, her small legs pumping furiously. Her face was streaked with tears, and her arms flailed as she waved him down. "Mr. Ethan, Mr. Ethan, help!" she cried, her voice trembling with desperation. Ethan slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the van, his heart pounding. "Lily, what's wrong?" he asked, rushing toward her. She grabbed his arm with both hands, her tiny fingers trembling. "It's Mommy," she sobbed. "She's hurt. Please, you have to help her." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. "Okay," he said firmly, crouching down to her level. "Take me to her. Show me where she is." Without hesitation, Lily turned and bolted back toward the house, pulling Ethan along with surprising strength. As they approached, the front door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Ethan's pulse quickened. The curtains were still drawn, casting long shadows across the porch. Inside, the living room was a wreck. A shattered lamp lay in pieces on the floor, and the coffee table was overturned, its contents strewn across the rug. The air smelled faintly of alcohol and something metallic. Ethan's stomach churned as his eyes landed on Clara Harris, slumped against the base of the couch. Her head lolled to one side, and her arms hung limply at her sides. The dark bruise marred the side of her face, and a thin trickle of blood ran from her temple. "Mommy!" Lily screamed, rushing toward her. "Lily, wait," Ethan said, grabbing her before she could touch her mother. "Let me check her first." Kneeling beside Clara, Ethan gently placed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. Relief flooded him when he felt the faint, steady rhythm beneath his fingertips. She was unconscious but alive. He scanned her injuries, noting the swelling on her cheek and the gash on her forehead. "Clara," he said softly, shaking her shoulder lightly. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hand shaking as he relayed the situation to the operator. "There's been an assault," he said, his voice tight. "The victim is unconscious, and her daughter is here with me. We need an ambulance at 47 Magnolia Lane, right now." The operator assured him that help was on the way and instructed him to stay with the victim. Ethan turned to Lily, who was clutching her mother's hand and crying silently. "She's going to be okay," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The ambulance is coming. They're going to take care of her." Lily nodded, her tear-streaked face a mixture of hope and fear. "It was Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He got so mad, and Mommy told him to leave, but he wouldn't. He hit her." Ethan's jaw tightened as a wave of anger surged through him. "Where is he now?" he asked. "He left," Lily said, her voice trembling. "He took his car and drove away." The faint sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, signaling the arrival of help. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Lily's shoulder. "You're so brave," he said quietly. "You did the right thing by coming to me." As the paramedics and police officers arrived, the quiet suburb of Brookwood Estates was about to have its facade of perfection shattered. The truth behind the Harris family's turmoil was darker than anyone could have imagined. And Ethan, who had started his day delivering mail, found himself at the center of a story he couldn't walk away from. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. Shattered facades. The flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles cast eerie patterns on the manicured lawns and pristine facades of Brookwood Estates. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains or stood on their porches, murmuring amongst themselves. It was a scene straight out of a crime drama, but for Ethan Brooks, it was all too real. As the paramedics wheeled Clara Harris out of the house on a stretcher, Ethan stood near the doorway, his heart pounding. Clara's face was swollen and bruised, her once bright features now ghostly pale. The gash on her forehead had been hastily bandaged, but blood still seeped through. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. Lily clung to Ethan's side, her small hand clutching his tightly. She didn't cry anymore. She simply stared at her mother with wide, unblinking eyes. The weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air, and Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process the chaos that had unfolded. A police officer approached Ethan, a tall woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. Her name tag read Officer Sanders, and her demeanor was brisk but not unkind. "You were the one who called this in?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Lily," he gestured toward the little girl at his side. "She ran to me for help. I found Clara unconscious in the living room." Sanders nodded, her expression grave. "And the suspect? Do you know who did this?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at Lily. The little girl looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with fear. She said it was her father, Ethan finally said, his tone measured. Sanders knelt down to Lily's level, her voice softening. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Officer Sanders. Can you tell me your dad's name?" Lily hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "It's James," she whispered. "James Harris." Sanders nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Lily. You're very brave." She stood and turned to another officer. "We need to put out an APB on James Harris. Likely driving a black sedan, probably heading out of town. He's dangerous. Approach with caution." As the officers began coordinating their efforts, Ethan felt a surge of anger. How could someone do this to their own family? He'd seen enough in his life to know that the worst monsters often wore familiar faces, but seeing the evidence firsthand was something else entirely. The paramedics invited Ethan and Lily to ride with them to the hospital. Ethan didn't hesitate. There was no way he was leaving Lily alone in this. As they sat in the back of the ambulance, Ethan held Lily's hand while she clutched her stuffed bear tightly in the other. The ride was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor attached to Clara. Lily's gaze never left her mother, her small frame trembling with every bump in the road. "Mr. Ethan." Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy's going to be okay?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's in good hands now, Lily. The doctors are going to take care of her. But what if Daddy comes back?" she asked, her voice quivering. "He gets so mad." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to promise her that everything would be fine, that her father would never hurt them again, but he knew better than to make promises he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently. "I'll make sure you're safe, Lily. I promise." At the hospital, the emergency room was a flurry of activity. Clara was rushed into surgery to address internal injuries that the paramedics had feared might be life-threatening. Ethan and Lily were directed to a small waiting area, where they sat in silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting harsh shadows on the pale green walls. Lily sat with her knees drawn to her chest, the stuffed bear clutched to her chest like a lifeline. Ethan sat beside her, unsure of what to say. He wasn't a parent or a counselor, just a mailman who had been in the right place at the right time. Or maybe the wrong place, depending on how you looked at it. A nurse approached them after what felt like an eternity. She was young, with kind eyes and a calming presence. "Are you here for Clara Harris?" she asked softly. "Yes," Ethan replied, sitting up straighter. "How is she?" "She's stable," the nurse said, offering a small smile. "The surgery went well, and she's in recovery now. She's still unconscious, but the doctors are optimistic." Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you." The nurse knelt down to Lily's level. "You can see your mommy soon, okay? But she needs to rest for a little while." Lily nodded, her lips trembling. "Can I stay with her?" "Of course," the nurse replied gently. "We'll set up a room for you nearby." As the hours passed, Ethan watched over Lily, who had finally fallen asleep in one of the stiff waiting room chairs. Her small frame looked even smaller under the oversized hospital blanket. Ethan's mind wandered, replaying the events of the day. He thought about James Harris, the man who had caused all of this pain. Where was he now? Was he still out there, planning to come back and finish what he'd started? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted when Officer Sanders entered the waiting room. She nodded at Ethan before sitting down across from him. "We've put out an alert for James Harris," she said without preamble. "Highway Patrol and local departments are on the lookout. He won't get far." Ethan nodded. "Good. He shouldn't be able to walk away from this." Sanders studied him for a moment. "You did a good thing today," she said. "Not everyone would have stopped to help." "I couldn't just walk away," Ethan replied. "Lily needed someone, and I was there. It wasn't anything special." Sanders shook her head. "It was more than you think. That little girl's life might have been very different if you hadn't stepped in." Ethan looked over at Lily, her chest rising and falling gently as she slept. "I just hope it's enough," he said quietly. Sanders stood. "We'll do everything we can to make sure they're safe," she said, "and that Harris faces justice." As Sanders left, Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. The day had been long and harrowing, but it wasn't over yet. He knew that the road to healing for Clara and Lily would be a long one, and as for James Harris, Ethan could only hope the man would be caught before he could hurt anyone else. In that moment, Ethan made a silent vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to help the Harris family rebuild their lives. Because sometimes, being a hero didn't mean wearing a cape or saving the world. Sometimes, it just meant being there when someone needed you most. The chase for justice. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over Brookwood Estates as the town's tranquil veneer began to crack. James Harris, the man responsible for the chaos in the Harris household, was now the subject of a manhunt. As Ethan Brooks sat in the hospital waiting room, keeping watch over a sleeping Lily, the world outside was closing in on James. But catching him wouldn't be simple. James Harris, the fugitive. James gripped the steering wheel of his black sedan, his knuckles white and his jaw tight. He glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting flashing lights to appear at any moment. His mind raced, replaying the events of the house. Clara had pushed him too far this time, he told himself. It wasn't his fault. She had provoked him. The faint smell of whiskey lingered in the car, a reminder of the morning's drinks that had fueled his rage. His hands trembled as he adjusted the air conditioning, trying to calm his nerves. He needed to get far away. Fast. The border of the neighboring state wasn't too far, and once he crossed it, he could lay low for a while. Maybe even start over. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a burner phone. His plan had been sloppy, rushed. He needed money and a place to hide. Dialing a number, he waited for the call to connect. "Yeah." A gruff voice answered. "It's me," James said, keeping his tone low. "I need a place to crash, just for a few days." There was a pause. "James, what the hell have you gotten into?" "Nothing," James snapped. "Just a misunderstanding. I'll explain later. Can you help me or not?" Another pause. "Fine. But this is the last time. You know where to find me." James hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. His hands clenched the wheel again as he veered onto the highway, speeding toward the edge of town. The investigation tightens. Back at the hospital, Ethan found himself sitting across from Detective Sarah Morgan, the lead investigator assigned to the case. Morgan was a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, her short cropped hair framing a face etched with determination. She had arrived shortly after Clara's surgery, intent on piecing together the full story. "We've confirmed James Harris as the primary suspect," Morgan said, her voice measured but firm. She flipped through her notes. "We've got an APB out, and Highway Patrol is setting up roadblocks. It's only a matter of time before we catch him." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "Lily told me he's dangerous." He was furious when Clara tried to leave. Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. Abusers like him don't give up control easily. Leaving is often the most dangerous time for a victim. Clara's decision to escape may have saved her life, but it also escalated his behavior. Ethan looked toward the small play area where Lily sat coloring, her stuffed bear by her side. "She's just a kid," he said softly. "She shouldn't have to live through something like this." Morgan followed his gaze, her expression softening. "No, she shouldn't. But thanks to you, she has a chance at a better future." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. "I just did what anyone would have done." Morgan arched an eyebrow. "You'd be surprised how many people look the other way." The break in the case. Hours later, as the night settled in, a breakthrough came. One of the patrol units had spotted a black sedan matching James Harris's vehicle at a gas station just outside of town. The station attendant, a sharp-eyed man named Tom, had recognized James from the description in the police bulletin. I thought he looked jumpy, Tom explained over the phone to Morgan. Kept looking over his shoulder. Bought a pack of smokes and filled up his tank. Soon as he left, I called it in. Morgan's team sprang into action, coordinating with nearby units to track James's route. Using traffic cameras and witness reports, they pinpointed his direction, westbound on Highway 19, heading toward the state line. A high-speed pursuit. James glanced at the speedometer. He was pushing 90 miles per hour now, the engine roaring as the car ate up the miles. His hands were clammy, sweat dripping down his temple. His escape wasn't going as smoothly as he'd hoped. He had spotted a patrol car in the distance minutes ago, and now the flashing lights were unmistakable in his rearview mirror. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. The patrol car's sirens wailed as it pursued him, weaving through the sparse traffic. James swerved into the opposite lane to avoid a slow-moving truck, narrowly avoiding a head-on collision. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he realized the futility of his situation. Ahead, a line of police cars blocked the highway, their lights casting a surreal glow on the asphalt. Spike strips glinted in the headlights, a clear signal that his run was over. "No, no, no," James shouted, jerking the wheel to avoid the trap. His car skidded violently, tires screeching as it spun out of control. The sedan veered off the road, crashing into a ditch with a deafening crunch. Officers surrounded the vehicle in seconds, their weapons drawn. "Step out of the car with your hands up," one of them shouted. James hesitated, his mind racing for a way out. But there was none. Slowly, he pushed open the door and raised his hands, his face a mask of anger and defeat. Back at the hospital. News of James's capture reached the hospital the following morning. Detective Morgan relayed the update to Ethan and Clara, who had regained consciousness but was still weak from her injuries. She lay in the hospital bed, her face pale, but her eyes determined. "He's in custody," Morgan said. "He'll face charges for assault, violating the restraining order, and endangering a child." Clara nodded, her voice hoarse but steady. "It's over then." "Not quite," Morgan said gently. "The legal process can be long, but we'll do everything we can to ensure he's held accountable." Lily sat beside her mother, holding her hand tightly. "Mommy, are we safe now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Clara smiled weakly, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe." Ethan watched the exchange, a mix of relief and admiration swelling in his chest. Clara had been through hell, but she was still standing, still fighting for her daughter. He had no doubt she would find the strength to rebuild their lives. As the sun rose over Brookwood Estates, casting warm light through the hospital windows, Ethan realized that while the road ahead would be long and uncertain, there was hope. And sometimes, that was enough to keep going. Healing in the wake of chaos. The morning after James Harris' capture dawned crisp and clear, but inside the hospital room where Clara Harris lay recovering, the atmosphere remained heavy with the aftermath of trauma. The world outside moved on as though nothing had changed. But for Clara, Lily, and Ethan, the pieces of their lives were only beginning to be reassembled. Ethan arrived early, carrying a small paper bag from the cafe down the street. He had barely slept, his mind swirling with the events of the past 48 hours. But the moment he walked into the room and saw Lily perched beside her mother's bed, her stuffed bear clutched tightly, Ethan felt a surge of determination. He wasn't family, but he wasn't about to walk away from them now. "Morning," Ethan said softly, stepping inside. Lily turned and offered him a small smile. "Hi, Mr. Ethan." Clara, her face still swollen and bruised, stirred and opened her eyes. Despite her visible pain, she managed a faint smile. "You're here early," she said, her voice hoarse. Ethan placed the bag on the small table by the window. "Thought you could use some real coffee," he said, pulling out a cup and handing it to her. "And there's a muffin in there for Lily." Lily's eyes lit up at the mention of a muffin, and she quickly grabbed the bag. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying the faintest hint of excitement. Ethan sat down in the chair by the bed, his gaze settling on Clara. "How are you feeling?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Sore," she admitted, shifting slightly, "but better than yesterday. The doctors say I'll make a full recovery." Ethan nodded, relieved. "That's good to hear." Clara's expression grew serious, her eyes searching his. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything. If you hadn't been there—" Her voice broke, and she looked away, blinking back tears. "You don't have to thank me," Ethan said gently. "You and Lily needed help. I just did what anyone would have done." Clara shook her head. "Not everyone would have. Most people look the other way." The neighbors rally. Later that day, Clara received a surprising visit. A group of neighbors had organized themselves to offer their support. Clara had always kept to herself, preferring to maintain her privacy, but now her living room was filled with familiar faces. They brought casseroles, gift cards, and even offers of babysitting for Lily. Ethan helped carry the food and supplies into the house, his heart warming at the outpouring of kindness. It was a stark contrast to the isolation Clara and Lily had endured. Mrs. Anderson, an older woman from 2 houses down, patted Clara's hand gently. "If you need anything, dear, don't hesitate to call," she said. "You're not alone in this." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know how to repay all of you." "Nonsense," Mrs. Anderson said firmly. "We're a community. We take care of our own." Ethan watched as Clara's walls slowly began to crumble. She had spent years hiding her pain behind a brave face, but now she allowed herself to lean on others, even if only slightly. It was a small step, but a significant one. Lily's first day back at school. A few days later, it was time for Lily to return to school. Clara had been hesitant, worried about how her daughter would adjust after everything she had been through. But Lily insisted she wanted to go back, eager for a sense of normalcy. Ethan offered to drive her, and Clara agreed. As they pulled up to the school, Lily's small hand tightened around her stuffed bear. Ethan noticed her hesitation and turned to her. "You're going to be okay," he said gently. "If anything feels too much, just tell your teacher, okay?" Lily nodded, her green eyes filled with both determination and uncertainty. "Okay." As she stepped out of the car, a few of her classmates spotted her and waved excitedly. "Lily's back," one of them shouted. Ethan watched as Lily's face lit up, her steps growing more confident as she joined her friends. The sight filled him with hope. Lily was resilient, far more than he had imagined. Clara's journey to independence. While Lily returned to school, Clara began her journey to reclaim her life. She had been connected with a local counselor who specialized in helping survivors of domestic violence. Her first session was nerve-wracking, but she pushed through, knowing it was a crucial step in healing. In their second session, Clara confided in the counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Morgan. "I stayed with James for so long because I thought I could fix him," Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought if I just tried harder, things would get better." Dr. Morgan nodded sympathetically. "Many survivors feel that way," she said. "But it's important to remember that abuse is never your fault. You didn't cause it, and you couldn't have stopped it. What matters now is building a safe and healthy future for yourself and Lily." Clara took those words to heart. She began setting boundaries, not just for others, but for herself. She reached out to her parents, whom she had grown distant from during her marriage, and found comfort in their unconditional support. She also started attending group sessions, where she met other women who had been through similar experiences. The trial looms. While Clara and Lily focused on rebuilding their lives, the legal system turned its attention to James. He faced a slew of charges, including assault, child endangerment, and violation of a restraining order. Detective Morgan kept Clara updated, but the thought of facing James in court filled her with dread. Ethan noticed the tension building in Clara as the trial date approached. One evening, as they sat on her porch, he decided to address it. "You're worried about the trial," he said gently. Clara nodded, her hands gripping her coffee mug. "I know I have to testify," she said, her voice shaky. "But the thought of seeing him again, it's terrifying." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And you're not alone in this. I'll be there, and so will Lily. You have a whole community behind you." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He smiled. "You don't have to thank me. You just focus on being the amazing mom that Lily needs. The beginning of something new." As the days turned into weeks, the Harris family began to find their footing. Clara filed for a permanent restraining order against James and started making plans to move closer to her parents. She wanted a fresh start, away from the memories that haunted Brookwood Estates. Ethan helped pack boxes, his role in their lives growing beyond that of a concerned neighbor. He had become a friend, a confidant, and a pillar of support. One evening, as they stood in the living room surrounded by boxes, Clara turned to Ethan. "You know," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips, "you're not just our mailman anymore." Ethan chuckled. "I guess not." "Your family," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And I'll never forget what you've done for us." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who had done what needed to be done. But as he looked at Clara and Lily, he realized that sometimes small acts of kindness could change lives in ways he never imagined. Facing the past in the courtroom. The courthouse was a grand, imposing structure in the heart of the city, its stone facade looming under a gray morning sky. Inside, the air buzzed with murmurs and quiet footsteps as people moved through the halls, some waiting for justice, others seeking resolution. For Clara Harris, it was both. She sat in the witness waiting room with Ethan by her side. Her hands clutched a warm paper cup of tea, but her knuckles were white, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, but her hair was neatly done, and her makeup covered most of the fading bruises. Today, she was determined to look strong, even if she didn't feel it. Lily wasn't with her. The court had arranged for a child advocate to stay with her during the trial, sparing her the traumatic ordeal of sitting through the testimony. Still, the little girl's presence lingered in Clara's mind, giving her the strength to face what lay ahead. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I'll be right here the whole time." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the tiled floor. "I know," she whispered, "but it's hard, knowing he's just down the hall." Ethan didn't need her to explain further. He had seen the scars, both physical and emotional, that James had left behind. The thought of James Harris sitting in the courtroom, smug and unrepentant, made Ethan's blood boil. But he also knew this wasn't his fight. It was Clara's, and she was ready. The courtroom drama begins. When Clara entered the courtroom, she felt a wave of nausea roll over her. The room was packed with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers. She avoided their gazes, focusing instead on the prosecutor, Angela Carter, who gave her a reassuring nod. Carter was a sharp, experienced attorney known for her no-nonsense approach, and Clara felt grateful to have her on their side. James Harris sat at the defendant's table, his suit neatly pressed and his hair combed back. He looked calm, even smug, as though he believed he could talk his way out of everything. Clara's stomach churned at the sight of him, but she straightened her shoulders and held her head high. The trial began with opening statements. Carter painted a vivid picture of James's years of abuse, highlighting the courage it had taken for Clara to leave. The defense, led by a slick attorney named Martin Caldwell, attempted to frame James as a loving father pushed to his limits by a contentious divorce. It was a narrative Clara had expected, but hearing it still made her chest tighten. Clara takes the stand. When Carter called Clara to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She walked with steady steps, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. Once sworn in, she sat down and took a deep breath, her eyes flicking briefly to James before focusing on Carter. "Mrs. Harris," Carter began, her voice steady but kind. "Can you tell us about the events leading up to the incident on September 12th? Clara nodded, her throat dry. "James and we had been separated for a year," she said. "The divorce was in process, and I had a restraining order against him, but he would still show up, angry, demanding to see Lily. That day, he came to the house unannounced. He was drunk." Carter guided her through the details, allowing Clara to tell her story in her own words. She described how James's anger had escalated, how he had pushed her into the coffee table, and how she had blacked out after hitting her head. Her voice faltered as she recounted the fear in Lily's eyes, but she pressed on, determined to tell the truth. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" Carter asked gently. Clara hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "I was afraid," she admitted. "I thought if I stayed, I could protect Lily. I thought I could manage his temper, but it only got worse." Carter gave her a moment before continuing. "What gave you the strength to leave?" Clara looked toward the gallery, where Ethan sat. She thought of Lily, safe with the child advocate. "Lily," she said firmly. "I couldn't let her grow up thinking this was normal. I couldn't let her think that this was love." The courtroom was silent as Clara's words hung in the air. Even the judge seemed moved. The defense strikes back. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, Caldwell approached the stand with a predatory gleam in his eye. He wasted no time trying to discredit Clara's testimony. "Mrs. Harris," he began, his tone smooth, "you've described my client as an abusive man, yet you stayed married to him for over 10 years. Can you explain why?" Clara's hands tightened on the edges of the witness stand. "Because I was scared," she said evenly, "and because I hoped he would change." Caldwell nodded, as if considering her words. "Scared. Yet during those 10 years, you didn't file a single police report against him. Isn't that correct?" "I was afraid of what he would do if I reported him," Clara replied. Her voice shook slightly but didn't waver. Caldwell pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "And isn't it true that during your separation, you allowed my client to visit your home on several occasions?" Clara hesitated, guilt flashing across her face. "Yes," she admitted. "But I only allowed it because he threatened me. He said he'd take Lily if I didn't." Caldwell smirked, sensing weakness. "Threats, Mrs. Harris? Or were you simply using your daughter as a pawn in your divorce proceedings?" Ethan clenched his fists as he watched from the gallery. Clara didn't deserve this. No one did. But to his amazement, Clara didn't back down. "I'm not the one who used Lily," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "James did. He used her as a weapon to control me. Everything I did was to protect her." The turning point. The prosecution's case gained momentum as Ethan and others testified. Ethan recounted the day Lily had run to him for help, his voice steady despite the pressure of the courtroom. He described finding Clara unconscious and the fear in Lily's eyes. His testimony painted a damning picture of James Harris' actions. The final blow came when Carter called as surprise witness, a former coworker of James who testified about his violent outbursts at work. The man's testimony shattered the defense's narrative of James as a loving father pushed to his limits. The verdict. After days of testimony and arguments, the jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom was packed when they returned, the tension palpable. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. A collective exhale swept through the room. Clara's shoulders sagged with relief, tears streaming down her face. Ethan reached out and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. As James was led away in handcuffs, his smug demeanor finally cracked. For the first time, he looked small, defeated. The first steps toward freedom. Outside the courthouse, Clara stood with Ethan, Lily, and Angela Carter. The sunlight felt warmer now, the air lighter. Clara looked down at Lily, who held her hand tightly. "It's over," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "It's the beginning," he said. "You're free now. You and Lily can start fresh." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you." Ethan smiled. "You're stronger than you know, Clara. This was all you." As they walked away from the courthouse, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she believed that she and Lily could build a life filled with love, safety, and the promise of brighter days ahead. Rebuilding a life, brick by brick. The courtroom victory marked a turning point in Clara Harris's life, but it was only the beginning of a long and arduous journey. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind, both visible and invisible, would take time to heal. As she and her 8-year-old daughter, Lily, returned to the quiet streets of Brookwood Estates, they faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives from the ground up. The weight of returning home. The Harris home, once a place of safety and warmth, now felt like a haunting reminder of what had transpired within its walls. The broken furniture had been removed, the shattered glass swept away, and the bloodstains scrubbed clean, but the memories lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Clara hesitated at the front door, the keys trembling in her hand. Lily stood beside her, clutching her stuffed bear, her eyes wide with apprehension. Ethan Brooks, their steadfast supporter, stood a few steps behind, carrying a box of groceries he picked up on their way back from the courthouse. "Take your time," Ethan said gently. "There's no rush." Clara nodded, drawing a deep breath before unlocking the door. She pushed it open, revealing the familiar living room. The sunlight streaming through the windows made the space appear almost serene, but Clara's chest tightened as she stepped inside. "Mommy." Lily's voice broke the silence. "Yes, sweetheart." Clara turned to her daughter, trying to mask her unease. "Are we going to be okay here?" Lily asked, her voice small but steady. Clara crouched down, pulling Lily into a gentle hug. "Yes, baby. We're going to be okay. It's our home, and we're going to make it feel safe again." Ethan set the box on the kitchen counter, giving them space. "If there's anything you need, just say the word," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. Clara straightened, glancing around the room. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He smiled. "It's what friends are for." Redefining normal. The first few weeks back home were difficult. Clara started therapy sessions twice a week with Dr. Morgan, the counselor who had helped her navigate the trial. Each session was a mix of tears and breakthroughs as Clara confronted years of buried trauma. "I spent so long pretending everything was fine," Clara admitted during one session. "I didn't realize how much it was eating away at me." Dr. Morgan nodded. "Acknowledging it is the first step toward healing. You've already taken some of the hardest steps, Clara." Meanwhile, Lily also began seeing a child therapist, a warm and patient woman named Emily, who helped her process her feelings through art and play. One day, Lily proudly brought home a drawing she had made in her session. It showed a bright yellow house with a heart over it, with 2 stick figures holding hands. "Who's that?" Clara asked, pointing to the larger stick figure. "That's you," Lily said with a shy smile. "And that's me. We're happy now." Clara's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow. "I love it, Lily. It's beautiful. A fresh start." Determined to give Lily a new beginning, Clara decided to move closer to her parents. They lived in a small but welcoming town 2 hours away, and the thought of being near family gave Clara a sense of peace. With Ethan's help, she began packing up their belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The process was cathartic in its own way. Clara discarded items that held painful memories, choosing instead to focus on the future. She found a small rental house near her parents' home, its cheerful exterior a stark contrast to the Harris home in Brookwood Estates. Ethan drove the moving truck on the day of the move, insisting on helping every step of the way. As they unloaded boxes into the new house, Clara paused to look around. The place was modest but bright, with a fenced yard where Lily could play. It felt like a clean slate. "What do you think?" Ethan asked as he set down the last box. Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. It feels like home. Building a community. Settling into the new town wasn't easy at first, but Clara was determined to build a life for herself and Lily. She found a part-time job at a local library, where she quickly became a favorite among the regular patrons. Her love for books and her gentle demeanor made her a natural fit. Lily adjusted to her new school with surprising resilience. On her first day, Clara worried about how her daughter would fare, but when she picked her up that afternoon, Lily was bubbling with excitement. "I made a friend," Lily announced. "Her name is Ava, and she likes the same books as me." Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Lily was thriving, and for the first time in years, Clara felt hopeful about the future. The role of an unexpected hero. Ethan visited often, making the 2-hour drive every few weeks to check in on Clara and Lily. His visits became a source of joy, not just for Lily, who adored him, but for Clara as well. They had developed a bond born of shared hardship and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Clara's new home, watching Lily chase fireflies in the yard, Clara turned to Ethan. "You've done so much for us," she said. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Ethan shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "You don't owe me anything, Clara. Watching you and Lily rebuild your lives, that's all the thanks I need." Clara looked at him, her heart full. "You're more than just a friend, Ethan. You're family." Ethan's eyes softened. "That means a lot to me, and you'll always have me in your corner." Looking ahead, months turned into a year, and the changes in Clara and Lily were evident. Clara's confidence grew as she embraced her independence, and Lily's laughter filled their new home. The nightmares that had plagued them both became less frequent, replaced by dreams of brighter days. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Lily looked up from her plate. "Mommy," she said. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we happy now?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Clara reached across the table, taking Lily's small hand in hers. "Yes, baby," she said with a smile. "We're happy, and we're safe." As the sun set outside, casting a warm glow over their little home, Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had faced darkness and come out on the other side, stronger, braver, and ready to embrace the future. For the first time, in a long time, Clara believed in the promise of tomorrow, and for her and Lily, that was more than enough. Closing the chapter. That evening, as the stars began to dot the sky, Clara tucked Lily into bed. The little girl had been full of energy earlier, running around the yard with her new friends, but now she looked peaceful as she hugged her beloved stuffed bear. "Mommy," Lily said sleepily, her voice soft. "Yes, baby." Clara leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I like it here," Lily murmured. "It feels like a good place." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm glad, sweetheart. You deserve a good place. Are you happy too?" Lily asked, her green eyes searching Clara's face. Clara smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm getting there," she said honestly. "Every day feels a little better." Lily nodded, satisfied with the answer. "Good night, Mommy," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. "Good night, my love," Clara said, pressing a kiss to Lily's forehead. As she turned off the light and stepped out of the room, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the new house or the safety of the town. It was the realization that she and Lily were truly free. Ethan's last visit. A week later, Ethan came by for what would be his final visit before Clara and Lily fully settled into their new lives. He arrived with a box of books for Clara and a small gift for Lily, which she tore open with delight. Inside was a set of paints and brushes, something she had mentioned wanting during one of Ethan's earlier visits. "Thank you, Mr. Ethan," Lily exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. "You're welcome, kiddo," Ethan said, his smile warm. I expect to see some masterpieces next time I visit." Lily ran off to test out her new paints, leaving Ethan and Clara alone on the porch. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You've got a good life here," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the soft glow of the evening sky. "I do. It's not perfect yet, but it feels right." "You've come a long way," Ethan said, his voice filled with admiration. "Both of you." Clara turned to him, her expression serious but kind. "And a lot of that is because of you, Ethan. You were there when we needed you most. I'll never forget that." Ethan shook his head, his modesty shining through as always. "You were the one who made the hard decisions, Clara. I just gave you a little nudge when you needed it." She smiled. "Maybe. But that nudge saved our lives." Ethan glanced toward the yard, where Lily was painting with abandon, her laughter echoing in the cool evening air. "You're going to do great here," he said. "And Lily, she's going to grow up strong and happy. I can see it." Clara felt a swell of gratitude. "Promise you'll visit again?" she asked. Ethan grinned. "You'll be sick of me before long." They both laughed, and for the first time in years, it felt easy, light. As the night deepened, Ethan bid them farewell, driving off into the dark with a wave and a promise to return. A new dawn. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Clara and Lily embraced their new lives with open hearts. Clara's work at the library flourished, and she began running a children's reading group that quickly became the highlight of her week. Lily, too, blossomed in the new environment, her laughter ringing through the house as she made friends, painted, and dreamed of the future. One day, as Clara sat on the porch, sipping her morning coffee, Lily came bounding out of the house, holding up a painting she had finished. It was a bright, colorful depiction of their new home, with the sun shining high in the sky and flowers blooming in the yard. "What do you think, Mommy?" Lily asked, her face glowing with pride. Clara took the painting, her eyes welling with tears. "It's beautiful, Lily," she said, "just like our life." Lily grinned and climbed onto Clara's lap, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. They sat together in the morning light, the past fading like a distant memory, replaced by the hope of the days ahead. For Clara, the journey had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. She had found strength she didn't know she had, love in unexpected places, and a future she could finally believe in. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Clara held Lily close and whispered, "We made it, baby. We're finally home." And for the first time in a very long time, she knew it was true.